What's going on, people? In this video we're going to be discussing the differences financially today, 2025 in the UK, to the 1970s in the UK. We're going to ask Google AI a few basic questions and see what it has to say. The reason I'm doing this video is because I saw a podcast a couple of days ago with a couple of billionaires and millionaires on it discussing this topic, and they were basically saying all the same things I'm going to say, but about America and about how things were generally easier for people, easier for families in the 1970s and 80s than it is today in 2020s, 2025s. Okay, and this podcast is a very prominent podcast in the podcasting world. Very good guys, entrepreneurs made millions and millions and millions of dollars. And when you hear stuff coming from these sort of guys, it's quite a riveting podcast, and it's quite riveting bits of information. They were asking ChatGPT and Google AI these certain bits of information. They were citing, credible resources and giving numbers and statistics which were quite astonishing. So I thought something similar about the UK would be quite useful for some people. And it's quite interesting just to see, and as it relates to sort of standard of living, cost of living, it's quite interesting to see the differences from the 1970s to now. So if we just ask some basic generic questions, and then you can go away and make up your own mind, or you can Google your own things and you can see what AI and other credible sources have to say about the same things I'm talking about. You can go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and jump straight in and ask Google AI about poverty. Okay, if you say into Google poverty in the UK today versus the 1970s, so poverty is significantly higher today than it was in the 1970s, with current levels around 50% higher than they were before 1979, which is quite an astonishing fact and quite an astonishing statistic, that poverty is literally 50% higher today than in the 1970s. I'm sure a lot of people, especially of the older generation, will probably argue the fact to the end of the earth that people were on the breadline a lot more in the 1970s than today. But according to all the stats, and according to what AI says, and according to credible sources like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, can't really argue with the stats and statistics. So that's poverty in a nutshell. There is 50% more today than there were in the 1970s. Let's ask Google the cost of living today versus the 1970s. If you type that into Google, Google will say, AI will say, the cost of living is significantly higher today compared to the 1970s, particularly for housing. Though some goods and services have become more affordable due to increased productivity and globalization, wages have not kept in pace with the housing price increases, resulting in a much worse income to house price ratio. Now, if we ask Google house to wage ratio today to the 1970s versus the 1970s, the UK's house to wage ratio has more than doubled since the 1970s, with the average home costing around 4.1 times the average earnings in the 1970s, compared to approximately 8.8 times the average earnings as of 2023, demonstrating a significantly reduced housing affordability today than the 1970s. While house prices have increased by over 300%, average earnings have only risen by 94%. Now, this is an important one because the accumulation of wealth is generally done by acquiring a house and then paying off that house, which is almost impossible for young people today in the UK, especially a young solo individual, sort of living on their own, paying for their own bills. Because generally, if you work a full-time job, and even if that job's a decent job, if you want to be able to buy clothes, and maybe you've got some kids you've got to pay for, you're left with very little at the end of the month, and I'm sure many people can attest to that. Let's ask Google AI the average wage today compared to the UK. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit nuanced because, of course, this argument is nuanced, and to me there's no clear-cut answer, because things like standards of quality of life and standards of living, we sort of change the parameters of these things as time goes on. But anyway, let's look at this nonetheless. So in the 1970s, the average annual wage was around £1,117, while today's average is approximately £45,000 mean average, or £37,000 median average. Most people I know don't earn that much, so I don't think this is a true statistic. And if you ask Google AI what's the average working class wage, it will bring up the number of £31,000, which seems more realistic to me. However, there's going to be different answers depending on how you ask these questions. So again, it's somewhat nuanced, but we can, in the median annual wage, generally it varies depending on the class, okay? So there's different classes in the UK, but if we're talking about the working class who make up the majority, then I would probably say it's closer to around £31,000. In today's money, £1,117 will have been somewhere around £20,000, £22,000, okay? So again, there's not much difference there. And of course, £22,000 in the 1970s, or £1,117 in the 1970s, would have bought you more then than what £31,000 will buy you today, especially as it relates to accumulating wealth like assets such as a house. So there is some nuanced arguments to have there, but I thought it was quite an important one to bring up because, again, it's not as clear-cut as you might think. Now, if you're to ask me just the general question about sort of Googling AI, I would probably say the answer is nuanced, and, certain things were, of course, more difficult in the 1970s than they are now, and certain things are more difficult now than they were in the 1970s. Specifically, things like creating financial security, job security, accumulating wealth. Much easier in the 1970s than today, but of course if you want to order a takeaway from Uber Eats, that's easier today than it was in the 1970s because you couldn't do it in the 1970s. If you wanted to order something off Amazon today and get it tomorrow, of course you couldn't do that in the 1970s. So of course access to material goods and things like that have increased. Disposable income to buy certain things like that, of course, is more prevalent in modern society because that's generally what you do, because you can't afford to buy anything else, so you just spend the bits of money you might have left on pointless shit. So that's that in a nutshell. Now, if we look at another question, if we ask the British pound, so the UK in the 1970s compared to today, it's just a very basic generalised question. It just says the British pound has lost 95% of its value since the 1970s. This means that today's prices are 19.77 times higher, as high as the average prices since 1970, according to the Office for National Statistics Composite Price Index. A pound today only buys 5% of what it could buy back then. So that's quite an astonishing fact as well, which you cannot escape the facts and the numbers. Okay. Now, moving on, let's go and ask Google a different question. In fact, I think we've pretty much hit everything that I wanted to say there. But in a nutshell, if you want to go ahead and Google any of these questions which I've posed to Google AI here in this video, you can go ahead and do that and you can see the answers for yourself. If you are a young person today, then the advice I would give you is save as much money as you can. Abstain from wasting money on pointless things like expensive coffees, buying bags of crisps, buying a £10 McDonald's meal is just not worth it, okay? Eat some beans and toast, eat healthy, be healthy, stay active, try and do some free hobbies, or try and get some hobbies which don't cost a lot of money. Don't go out drinking all the time, although if you do enjoy to go out and have a drink, then go ahead and do that, but try and keep the costs low. Don't be going out and paying £8 for a pint and then £10 for a burger, okay? Because that is absolutely ridiculous. In the 1970s, you wouldn't have had to work 2 hours of your life to earn a burger or a pint, okay? So don't do it today. Another thing I would probably say to the younger people, people around my generation is, you've just got to be smart and you've just got to look at things in the long view and abstaining from spending your money on pointless things like Uber Eats and Deliveroos and taxis here and there and everywhere. You want to be sort of looking to the future, trying to save as much money as you can, invest a little bit of money if you've got it, put a little bit of money to the side to maybe try to start up that business that you wanted to start or something like that to earn a bit of extra income. Because the fact of the matter is, if you've got a full-time job today and if you're earning the average wage today, which I would argue is around £31,000, I don't know where the £45,000 is coming from, because I know very few people on that sort of money around my age. Maybe it's for the older sort of generation, but generally people who are 30 years old like myself, or around 30 years old like myself, then they're not earning 45 grand. Okay, in fact, I'd probably argue that the last 500 people that I've met in my life do not earn anywhere near that amount of money. Okay. And as it relates to things like poverty in the UK today is 50% higher than it was in the 1970s. So this, you've got to be careful, okay? Because when that money runs out at the end of the month or the end of the week, going out and buying that loaf of bread for £1.50 is not going to be easy. And while we're here, let's just have a quick look. Average, let's just type in a minimum average loaf of bread cost today. If you type in average loaf of bread cost today in the UK, you will get £1.85. What is the average price of bread in the UK? £1.38. Okay, so that's approximately 10% of minimum wage, around 10% of minimum wage. So around 10% of your time, 10% of an hour, you can earn a loaf of bread. And let's just type in hourly rate in 1970s. Average hourly rate. £1. Okay, that's the US. Average. So the average hourly rate, well, it's a bit of a nuanced one again, because it says there is no single average hourly rate for the entire 1970s in the UK. Dividing these figures, okay, so we've got an answer here which is about £1.22, and the average cost of a loaf of bread was 9p. So if you were to buy a loaf of bread in the 1970s and you were to buy a loaf of bread today, it would basically be the same. Okay, but if we go back to the British pound has lost 95% of its value since the 1970s. It says a pound today only buys 5.059% of what it could buy back then, which is quite astonishing. Anyway, that's enough for this video, people. It's gone on long enough, longer than I wanted it to. Some interesting things, some interesting arguments for the 1970s, some interesting arguments against the 1970s, some interesting arguments for the 2025s and against the 2025s. In a nutshell, what I would say is that it was easier to do certain things back then than it is now, but it's easier to order off Amazon today than it was then, and that's quite obvious. Anyway, have a fantastic evening, have a most wonderful week ahead, and do not forget, stay strong, stay smart, and be cool.